illustration, just a living testimony and parable, if you will. Thanks, guys. All right. As we begin this morning, was just going to mention something that I think that we all connect with pretty readily, and it's the fact that we have a lot to learn from our pets. Now, you guys have a lot of pets: cats, dogs, turtles, iguanas, you name them. Even when they're not the smartest of creatures, I think that they can display to us some real simple virtues. I'll speak just a little bit about our own beloved pet at home. His name is Atlas. He's laid back, which I think is a real generous description of his activities day by day. He eats our food. He's really behind on rent. But if nothing else, we know that he's passionate about one thing. And he's passionate specifically about tennis balls. Tennis balls. Now, that said, we have a rule in our house that tennis balls aren't allowed in the house. All right? There's a reason that tennis balls aren't allowed in the house, is because of a little bit of a backstory. Atlas likes to bring tennis balls in the house, and then he plays a little game. He likes to wedge these tennis balls into places wherein then the game is he has to get them out of those places. And so a little ways back, he actually did bring in one of these tennis balls and he shoved it deep underneath one of the couches. And then in his quest to get said tennis ball, he destroyed the couch, tore the front of the couch off, and because this is what he wanted, and this was a really exciting thing. And so you can see why we would say, Atlas, no more tennis balls in the house, all right? But even though he's not the smartest of fellows, enters his ingenuity, right? His desire, his passion to still bring tennis balls in the house, even though he knows that they're not allowed, okay? So this guy's going to try everything to bring these inside and get them past the guards, and we almost have to set up a TSA kind of a situation where we check his bags and everything that he's bringing in the house because he's going to try to bootleg one of these in. And so we see in this animal, like we mentioned, this virtue displayed, something we can learn at least, tenacity, commitment. And this word tenacity, I think, is an important virtue, is an important word to consider a little bit because so much in life depends on it. You got athletes, hunger for success on the field of play, and tenacity is cardinal virtue, isn't it? We got students who are striving to learn and they want to receive a degree, and there's no way you're going to get to the end unless there's some tenacity. We got companies, employees, again, deserving, working with tenacity. Yeah, there's some exploration, I guess, the way you need to put it as it comes to the word tenacity, because on one level, we see the word tenacity as one that brings with it a real strength and a real beauty, but then at the same time, I think it's something that can sour quickly, all depending on the prize that people are after and the means by which they go after that prize. So tenacity is great, but what are you after and how are you going to seek it? So to have that theme, those questions in our minds. So today we're back on our theme of praying in the Old Testament. And it's a series which is about prayer, but it's also about discipleship because prayer is about talking with God. It's about our relationship with Him. Last week we looked at the story from the life of Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. If you weren't able to be with us, you can follow along, catch up via our podcast. Now this week we're going to look at a story from the life of Abraham's grandson, Jacob. And it's a fascinating story from Genesis chapter 32, which, yes, speaks to prayer in its own way, but then specifically is going to talk about tenacity as people like you and me walk with God. Now, before I read Genesis chapter 32, I want to do a little bit of a backstory and remind ourselves of the history of Jacob, okay? Because we're going to see this recurring theme in his life that then connects with what we're going to read today. Genesis chapter 25, Jacob is born. He's a twin, and just by minutes, he's the second born. But we see in him a tenacity right from the start, because when he comes out of the womb, he's already grasping at something. He's grasping at his brother's heel. Genesis chapter 25, a little further on in the story, we're going to see that he tries to manipulate out of his brother his birthright. Birthright isn't enough for Jacob, so in Genesis chapter 27, he cons his dad into thinking that he is his brother Esau, and he gets his father to pray over him a blessing. In Genesis chapters 27 through 29, we're going to be given kind of a bigger chunk of Jacob's story, and we see him fleeing the anger of his brother. He goes to live with his uncle. In the midst of his relationship with his uncle, he falls in love with Rachel, his uncle's daughter, and he agrees to work 7 years in order to marry Rachel. That's some tenacity, right? Well, perhaps you're familiar with the story. In the end, his uncle actually ends up conning him, and he ends up marrying Leah, the other daughter, first. And so then he's got to agree to work another 7 years to marry Rachel. So if we can see tenacity in the life of Jacob, we're hearing the right things. Well, eventually, his relationship with his uncle sours. He has to flee and go home. And this is then where we start to come into the framework of Genesis chapter 32. Jacob's at a place of fear and desperation where we read here specifically because as he's going home, he hears that his brother Esau is coming to greet him. And friendly as Esau is, he's bringing 400 armed men with him. Isn't that nice of Esau? So notably and understandably, Jacob is pretty afraid and he's pretty worked up. And so this is where we then read Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 and following. The scriptures say, that same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said to Jacob, then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. And therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. Well, in this passage, we see that Jacob has this most unique and remarkable encounter with God himself. God comes, he reveals himself to Jacob in human form, and the two engage in a struggle, in a literal wrestling match. And this whole incident, I think, is in line, as you've seen and as we've recounted, with the other parts of Jacob's life, right? He struggles with his brother. He struggles with his uncle. And now he's struggling with God in this chapter. And so we see this tenacious man, and here he's wrestling all night because he wants something that he believes that God can give to him. And so right away we want to be asking ourselves, what of Jacob's story describes our own? And then also, what does it teach us about relating to God, to prayer, and to tenaciously seeking his blessing in our own lives? So I want to explore some of the essential elements of this story in pursuit of these questions that are before us this morning. First off, I want to talk about this showdown between God and Jacob. As we look at this story, I think that the wrestling match that we read of here might not be as much of a surprise as we think it would be in the first place. Despite a lot of interactions that God and Jacob have had in his life up to this point, there's some things that still need addressing and that need settling once and for all. And I think there's indications in this story that God is actually setting things in motion to bring Jacob into the ring so that Jacob can be face to face with him. We do understand that there was this breakdown of a relationship between Jacob and his father-in-law that kind of makes him say, I can't live here anymore. But at a base level, it's actually God's call on Jacob's life to leave where he's been with his uncle and head back to what we might describe as the locus of blessing, to get back to the land that God has promised Abraham. So we find that Jacob kind of starts to be hemmed in because God has said, you need to go home. But all the while, Jacob is going, I know, but my brother Esau is there, and he is still plenty heated up about what happened in the past. I think all this and kind of being hemmed in and the anxiety that he feels about this is described in Genesis chapter 32 in a prayer that we see really of desperation that Jacob first offers to God. We read these words. Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. I'm not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and of the faithfulness you've shown your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan. Now I've become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I'll surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. As things heat up in his life, he prays this. Then as we get to the beginning of the text that we just read, we discover again these words. The same night he arose, he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children. He crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. As I read this story, it almost seems that Jacob knows something is coming. That he knows that he needs some alone time with God in this moment of tense and this moment of fear. That he needs to step into the ring with God and relate to him on some very important things. He could have just stayed with his singular prayer of desperation there and said, I'm going to leave it there. But it begins these verses wherein he sends everybody else ahead and he opens up this space. He almost seems to be ready that God would then come and interact with him. And so I'm wondering at the outset this morning as we consider these verses, when our lives heat up and our senses are maybe fearful, filled with angst over something going on in our lives, do we ever allow those to bring to our awareness that maybe, just maybe, God is in the midst of those things. Maybe, just maybe, he's been the one to orchestrate those things because he wants to invite us to spend specific, quiet, maybe even wrestling time with him so that he can speak to us on some things that for considerable amount of time he's maybe been saying, let's talk. Let's get into these very significant things in your life because I want to address them once and for all. I think that's a good and a critical question that as we come into some of these same pressure points that Jacob did, that we would ask God, is there anything that you want to speak to me about? The showdown. Let's talk also now about tenacity as a virtue. Tenacity as a virtue as it revealed to us in this story. There's something that's interesting to me as I read this passage. It's this. My thought as God starts to interact with Jacob is that he would condemn Jacob's kind of obsession with blessing. But instead, when we get to verse 28 and the new name that God gives to Jacob, it almost seems as if God celebrates his tenacity. Because we read, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you've striven with God and with men, and you've prevailed. This name now erases his old name of Jacob, heel grabber. Maybe the guy who's coming from behind with the slide tackle, with manipulations to get the things that he wants in life. And now God says, your name is going to be God Wrestler. Because you've tumbled with the Lord and you've prevailed. You've actually been blessed. And what is he actually praying for? I guess I should say wrestling for. Verse 26. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now there's all likelihood that at this point in time, because of some of the heat he's experiencing, that he's asking for protection in the moment, rescue from Esau, but certainly in other activities of his life. At some point in time, Jacob saw the blessing that was on his grandfather Abraham's life, on his father Isaac's life, and he said, I want that. And then we watch throughout the course of his life this tenacity that this is something that he is after. And now God blesses him with this new name. And it's not that God is condoning every way that Jacob has gone about receiving this blessing, but God seems to recognize and honor, and he's pleased with the tenacity that has been displayed for his blessing in his life. So as to say, you're on the right path, Jacob. You're on to the right things, even if God still needs to learn him a couple things in the ring, right? How about our tenacity? How much do we want God's blessing and the deep things of God for ourselves? Many times I'm afraid that my desire for the Lord just doesn't go very deep. Sure enough, we hear the things of the gospel and we say to ourselves, I don't want to face God's judgment. So I'll receive Christ as my Savior. Certainly as I walk through life, I want God's providential care and his protection. But when it comes to the deep things of God, which he has provided to us in Jesus, they're already ours, but his longing that we would experience them, our growth in character, our discipleship, closer fellowship with him, those really call for a singular tenacity, and many times that's where our hearts fail. Sometimes we can test ourselves to understand, wherein do our true desires lie? And we can ask some real practical questions like, hey, if we went to our Amazon shopping cart right now, what's queued up, ready to go as soon as we can scrape together a little bit of change to purchase those things? A lot of times our hobbies, and we've done some research, and we're like, hey, if I could get this, that'd be really cool. Or we think about maybe a Pinterest board, right? Shows us the things that we are passionate about. Or maybe we're someone and we're willing to stay up till midnight because we know that unless we buy the concert tickets at 12:01, we're going to miss them, and we're willing to just go nuts and be that person that stays up till all hours of the night to do it. These things demonstrate to us the things that we're passionate about, right? And I'm not saying any of those things are wrong in and of themselves, but I wonder, is there anything in your relationship with the Lord that you might even describe as you're sitting there at midnight going, I want to be the first person to click on this. I'm just so hungry to grow, maybe in some new area with the Lord, or to pursue something that we don't fully understand. Or, Jesus, I want to be a dad that glorifies you, or I want to grow to be a light in the career that you have called me to. I think we can ask these questions. Do I have a tenacious desire for God and his blessings in my life? The author C.S. Lewis wrote in the book, The Weight of Glory, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak, Lewis says. We're half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Can you hear what he's saying there? Then he goes on with his amazing analogy. He says, we're like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. We're far too easily pleased. So we look in our lives and wonder, would anybody celebrate tenacity for God's blessing as they look at our lives? Let's talk now about the sovereign blesser. So we have in this story this fascinating encounter. Again, this theophany where God shows up in human form. We shared last week that theophany is kind of our fancy theological word for God showing up in human form in the Old Testament. We had another example of that back with Abraham last week. It's amazing because this wrestling match between Jacob and God goes on all night. It seems that this man cannot overpower Jacob. Verse 25, a little bit later in verse 26, he asks that Jacob would release him. But in all of this, I can't help but feel that what we're reading here is a wrestling match like that of a father with a sweaty 4-year-old in the living room, wherein God is condescending to Jacob for a time so that he can teach him some valuable things about tenacity. Because as we read, a mere touch from God to Jacob's hip wrenches it out of socket. You know how strong the hip joint is? Think about the injuries, the sports injuries that we hear about in the NFL. All kinds of knees, all kinds of shoulders, hardly ever a hip because it's just such a strong joint. But just one touch, out of joint. This is strength. God renames Jacob and completely changes his identity just by saying it. Later on, when Jacob realizes everything that's going on, he's going to say, I'm amazed that I got out of that situation with my life in the first place. So I think it's clear that in the end, whatever the struggle might appear to be, God alone is the sovereign one with the resources and the power to bless Jacob. I don't think anything in this story is meant to suggest that humans have the physical strength or the strength of will to wrestle blessings out of God's hand somehow against his will. I think that the story reminds us rather that tenaciously hungering for God's blessing is always the right thing, but we remember that he is the one who sovereignly gives it. So tenaciously hungering for God's blessing in our lives is always the right thing. But we remember that he's the one who sovereignly gives it, which I think begins to reshape our understanding of tenacity is defined by this story. When we think of tenacity, a lot of times we think of power and overpowering and cunning. And that's the kind of tenacity that Jacob has shown up until this point. But I think this story helps us to see that Jacob's no-quit tenacity, while it was right, was not by way of the strength of limb wherein he secured God's blessing. I think in the end, he learns in the midst of this situation that it's tenacious weakness. It's tenacious desperation. You might almost call it ugly, sweaty faith, wherein he's holding on to God for all that he is worth to receive a blessing that he can't wrestle by power from God's hands, but he can only hold on to for dear might that God would pour his blessing into his life. There's a helpful hint towards this a little later in the Old Testament. Hosea, chapter 12, verses 3 through 4, describes and recounts this. In the womb, he took his brother by the heel. In his manhood, he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought God's favor. There's kind of these two flavors here. The strength is just holding on, in a sense, for dear life. But then there's this desperation of faith saying, I don't deserve anything. I can't force this, but I would hold on to you in sheer faithful desperation until your good blessing is poured into my life. Scripture's filled with this overall theme, I think, and that those who want the right things from God and who come to him in a desperate hunger will receive from the Lord everything that they're asking and more. So recount them with me. Jeremiah 29, verse 13. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. Matthew 5, verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. And then so importantly, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. And without faith, it's impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. Another translation says, those who earnestly seek him. As New Testament Christians, God is waiting for us to fully experience all the blessings he has for us in Jesus. That's one of the remarkable things about being a child of God is we're not asking that those things would be provided in the first place. Jesus won the blessings of God for us. But what we're stepping into by way of discipleship is a full realization and an experience of those gifts that are ours freely by grace. But this is something that we can't wrestle out of God's hands. But it is something that if we hold on with desperate hunger, we can receive from God's hands. Because He alone is the sovereign blesser. So I'm going to look at one more important aspect of this story, and I think it's described as the theme of remembering. The theme of remembering. This is a significant life, no doubt, in Jacob's life. It's a significant night in the whole history of Israel. And while it's going to be in his mind and heart for the rest of his life, both God and Jacob really want to cement things. And they do so in some significant ways. Jacob receives a new name. You'll not be called Jacob anymore. You're going to be called Israel. The place where they are is given a new name, Peniel, because it was here that you saw God's face. Even the last verse of this chapter is very unique. Verse 32, therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. Even the people of God didn't want to forget the wounding of Jacob in this encounter, because there was something important in it to consider. I think in particular, as it comes to remembering, we can ponder for a few moments woundedness. Woundedness in the life of all disciples of Jesus, and the way that God uses places of woundedness in our lives to remind us of what He's doing in our lives. Some of us have limps. Some of us have scars. Some of these are past hurts in our lives. Others are battle scars from the spiritual struggle, maybe being in the midst of ministry. Some of us, like Jacob's, are scars or limps that are actually from the Lord's discipline. But even as we seek the balm of God's healing for those things in our lives which hurt, it's also important that we remember that the scars, the wounds, are very often the places that are almost as if they're a port wherein God pours His grace and blessing and understanding of His presence and ministry in our lives. I read this week of a young woman who had esophageal stomach cancer. I read this story in the Daily Bread devotional, and some of you use that on a daily basis. I'm always blessed by that. But this young woman's story was profound by way of something that connects with Jacob and his own woundedness. So she had gone through this surgery for cancer, and she was considering the jagged scar now that would be with her the rest of her life from this surgery. And as she was interacting with her husband about this, she said, you know what? Scars can represent two things in my life, and either or. They can either remind me of the pain of cancer or of the start of healing. And she said, I choose that my scars will be a symbol of the beginning of healing in my life. And certainly that was the beginning and the continued ministry of God in Jacob's life. I couldn't help but think about this in the life of a woman from a past ministry that I was a part of, a woman who literally lived with scars and a physical limp from this very significant moment in her life. After years and years of wrestling with God, indeed, a period in her life of pushing God away that eventually culminated in a police chase where she was in a fiery car wreck, to have been burned on a significant part of her body, to lose one of her legs. These wounds, literally a limp was with her continually for the rest of her life. And yet the amazing thing for her and then her family and the story that God wrote in her life after this, I believe and I know because I've heard from her, she would say, that was the birth. That was God pouring his blessing into my life, and she wouldn't change it. And now, even in a recent couple of months, she was on a missions trip to Uganda, able to be in some of the prisons there in that country. And guess what she's able to share with them? Hey, after that fiery crash and being burned and losing my leg, I actually spent time in prison for the crimes that I had committed. But in the midst of all of that, God changed her life forever and brought his blessings into her life, specifically through those times of woundedness. Friends, many of us have those same type touches of God in our lives. And again, even as it is right for us to seek healing and the Lord's restoration, he brings so much of that. Some of the greatest blessing, some of the richest things that he brings to us comes through those very places of woundedness. I want to close with a scripture that I think ties into this in some very significant ways. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6, which reminds us of this. Let light shine out of darkness, God said. And he's shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God to us in the face of Jesus Christ. You know, we see Jacob with this opportunity, this remarkable moment wherein he meets God face to face, and then he wrestles with him. But just so we don't think, you know what, those are Old Testament things. Those are Old Testament stories. Brothers and sisters, remember that you and I have met God face to face in his son Jesus, and in a far clearer way than Jacob ever experienced. And as we relate to God through his son Jesus, face to face, the power of the Holy Spirit, the blessing that we realize is that we don't beg now to receive God's blessing. It has been freely and fully given to us because of everything that Jesus has done, his death and his resurrection. Again, remember, this message is not about a tenacity wherein somehow we can receive God's blessing or achieve God's blessing. I think the best way to describe it is that we would be able to step into it and experience and fully actualize the richness and the blessings that are there for us in Jesus. Wherein the tenacity that we're talking about today takes on a completely different flavor as well. The tenacity now that we step into in our walk with Jesus is no longer described as a tenacity wherein we are red-faced or wherein we are white-knuckled. Because of Jesus and what he's done in our union with him, the tenacity that we now experience is one of rest, wherein we remain in him as Jesus calls us to. Wherein, yes, we hold on for dear life, but we hold on knowing that God is holding us and blessing us. And it's all through Jesus in the strength of his Holy Spirit. So as we walk from this place, remembering that tenacity for God's blessing is always the right thing. And as we remember that God is the one who sovereignly gives it, we come knowing that Jesus is the one who secured the blessing for us. And now by faith in him, we have received those. And on a daily basis, as we remain in him, we can experience fully the blessings that he has for us by faith and holding on to our Savior, Jesus Christ.